Democrats went to the White House prepared to offer the president the opportunity to launch an historic infrastructure initiative. We had met 3 weeks before. The idea that and was a good, positive meeting about how we build the infrastructure of our country, roads, bridges, mass transit, broadband in rural areas and in underserved urban areas as well, water systems, both wastewater and safe, clean drinking water, infrastructure for our satellites so that our technology works here. For all of these things, we were optimistic. We also were hoping for housing and school construction as a further part of the conversation. But the question is, how was it paid for? And the president was going to, the plan was, as we agreed at the meeting 3 weeks ago, the president was to present his proposals at yesterday's meeting. Well, everyone, he started sending signals that he might not be ready or interested. The night before, he sent us a letter to Chuck Schumer and to me saying that he doesn't want to do infrastructure until we do the U.S., Mexico, Canada. If that's not the accurate character, some people call it after NAFTA, some call it NAFTA 2.0, but anyway, that trade agreement, and that was a strange juxtaposition. But nonetheless, the next day, you know what happened. I think what happened, he says it's because of cover-up, and I know that strikes a chord with him, and he's afraid of cover-up, but afraid of being accused of cover-up. But I really think that what he knew the one court decision was getting into territory that he did not want touched, and they did not allow the Mueller investigation to go into the president's personal finances. So Mazur was a setback for him, and then he must have known the Deutsche Bank decision would be consistent, but in any event, to inoculate against its presentation, he pulled a stunt. Now, I truly believe that the president has a bag of tricks, and the White House has a bag of tricks that they save for certain occasions. They don't necessarily apply to the occasion, but they're a distraction, which is his master of distraction. We will all agree on that. That's something he does well, to distract from problems that he has. He tries to change the subject. And while he tried to say it's because I said cover-up, we've been saying cover-up for a while. And our 9 o'clock meeting was a meeting we have anyway, so it had nothing to do with him. But I think what really got to him was these court cases and the fact that the House Democratic Caucus is not on a path to impeachment, and that's where he wants us to be. And when he saw that that was not happening, that, again, with the cover-up, which he understands is true, just struck a chord. So it was really sad because, as I said to some of you yesterday, Thomas Jefferson, one of our third president, had the first infrastructure initiative. He tasked Gallatin, who was his Secretary of the Treasury, and I said that to the Secretary of the Treasury yesterday after the president left the room, that he tasked his Secretary of the Treasury to put together a big infrastructure plan to follow the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase, to build into the infrastructure of America, Cumberland Road, Erie Canal, things like that. That's so important to our country in terms of commerce and mobility and the rest. And then 100 years later, Teddy Roosevelt, he initiated his infrastructure plan, which was green, the establishment of the National Park Service. Later in the century, President Eisenhower put forth the interstate highway proposal. It was very bipartisan. The leader in the Senate was Lyndon Johnson, in the House, Sam Rayburn, and the President of the United States, a Republican President Eisenhower, working together to pass that for the good of the country. And its purpose under President Eisenhower was that it would unify America. It was a defense issue. So what we're talking about now, infrastructure, the president says I word. I thought he was talking about infrastructure, roads, bridges, mass transit. I said some of these things already. I thought we could give him the opportunity to make a historic contribution to the safety, because it's a safety measure, it's about commerce, it's about safety, it's about mobility, product to market, and the rest. It's about clean air, clean water. It's about a better future for our country, much needed, trillions of dollars in deficit in terms of low or no maintenance that we haven't afforded. It's never been partisan. We don't want it to be partisan now. But I can only think that he wasn't up to the task of figuring out the difficult choices of how to cover the cost of what the important infrastructure legislation that we had talked about 3 weeks before. But the president, again, stormed out. And I think, first pound the table, walk out the door. What? Next time, have the TV cameras in there while I have my say. That didn't work for him either. And now this time, another temper tantrum. Again, I pray for the President of the United States. I wish that his family or his administration or his staff would have an intervention for the good of the country. Yes, ma'am.
Madam Speaker, would you be prepared to change your rhetoric, given the political landscape, your understanding of the president's temperament? Your prayer comments almost suggest you're concerned about his well-being.
I am. And the well-being of the United States of America.
Would you be prepared to do something differently for the pragmatism of getting more done, to not use phrases like cover up or to not perhaps provoke him? Would you be open to that?
Well, you have bought into his excuse.
No,
that was not a reason that he did that yesterday. That was an excuse for him to do that. And with all due respect to your question, I do not intend not to honor my oath of office, nor do my colleagues in the House of Representatives, to honor our oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, which has a system of checks and balances, separation of power in it. And again, it's a question of the American people understanding that what he is doing is an assault on the Constitution of the United States. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. I hope he can, too.
Yesterday you said that the president may have engaged in impeachable offenses.
Yeah.
Yet today you're saying you're not on a path to impeachment. Can you explain why you're opposed to launching an impeachment inquiry, as many of your members want to do?
Let me be really very clear. The president's behavior in terms of his obstruction of justice, the things that he is doing, it's very clear. It's in plain sight. It cannot be denied. Ignoring subpoenas, obstruction of justice. Yes, these could be impeachable offenses, but I intend not to, the three things. You might understand it better if you remember these three things. We want to follow the facts to get the truth to the American people, with a recognition, too, that no one is above the law, and three, that the president is engaged in a cover-up. And that is what my statement is. How we deal with it is a decision that our caucus makes, and our caucus is very much saying whatever we do, we need to be ready when we do it. And I do think that impeachment is a very divisive place to go in our country. And what we can get the facts to the American people through our investigation, it may take us to a place that is unavoidable in terms of impeachment or not. But we're not at that place yet. Yes, Casey.
Another meeting with the president after what happened. Can you work with him?
Of course. I mean, we're dealing with a situation that is becoming more predictable. But I do think that we have a responsibility to try to find common ground. It's funny you asked that question, Casey, because yesterday I was going to start the meeting in terms of course, putting it in historic perspective, as I have done here, but also say we're very busy people, the leaders in the Congress, especially the President of the United States, I think. And a meeting between the leaders of the Congress and the President is an historic meeting. This is not a casual coming together of Democrats and Republicans. This is an historic meeting. It's the leadership of the legislative branch, the first branch of government, and the President of the United States. So let's make it count for something. Let's really make it count for something. By dint of preparation, by dint of respect for each other's views, understanding that we'll have to yield on points to get results for the American people. But he obviously was not prepared. By dint of preparation, he was not prepared, and so he used some excuse to go out the door. And I will not take responsibility for his irresponsible behavior because we're pointing out the truth to the American
Leader
people.
Pelosi, you have a lot of issues.
Excuse me, she has a follow-up.
Given the gravity of the meeting, Kellyanne Conway made a remark to you at the end of the meeting. She's apparently expanded on her remarks.
I'm not going to talk about her. I responded as the Speaker of the House to the President of the United States. Other conversations people want to have among themselves is up to them. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, obviously, you guys have a lot of major legislative issues that you need to address this summer. The Treasury Secretary here was talking about raising the debt ceiling, the import of that.
Yeah.
They're going to need Democratic votes. To add the other question here, how do you go back and re-engineer this? You might not get infrastructure, but you got to keep the government open, and you have to raise the debt ceiling, and they're going to have Democratic votes, and the president is going to have that.
Why don't you go ask that question of the President of the United States? We have always been responsible. Left to their own devices, our appropriators can always, I'm an appropriator, that I forge in that culture, intelligence and appropriations. And in those days, they were not really partisan arenas. So frankly, on disaster assistance, we could have gotten there left to their own devices of the appropriators until the White House intervened. So we will have to pass the appropriations bills, and we will, and hopefully we will do them in a very timely fashion. The debt ceiling will have to be lifted, and that's a matter of this conversation that we're having on the debt ceiling. We're not saying, as the president said, if you don't stop investigating me, if you don't stop honoring your oath of office, I can't work with you. That's basically what he's saying. Maybe he wants to take a leave of absence. I don't know. But on the other hand, we understand what our responsibilities are. We're fully prepared to go forward. It really will be up to them to have some level of cooperation.
You in a better position to ask for more, though, because of the bill.
But we want to do what we have to do that is right for the American people, respectful of all the equities that have to be weighed. One more, because we have to go back to the floor.
You said in private, you suggested it today, that the president wants to, on some level,
Of course, I told you that.
Can you explain that a bit? And could you also explain the comment you made about the staff doing an intervention?
Okay, the what intervention?
You made a comment that you thought the staff might want to do.
Oh, I thought you said statutory intervention. That would be good. Article 25. Troublemaker. That's a good idea. I'm glad you suggested it. I'll take it up with my caucus. Not that they haven't been thinking about it, but your support will be important to them. What was the first? Oh, yes. Oh, there's no question. The White House is just crying out for impeachment. That's why he flipped yesterday, because he was hoping, because he was, somehow or other, you all have a story that isn't real. I mean, you want to believe that there's all this unease in our caucus. That simply isn't the truth. We have respect for the diversity of opinion in our caucus, and I say to the caucus, our diversity is our strength. Our unity is our power, and we have unity in our caucus. And so when he saw that, see, he's saying, oh, you called that meeting at 9 o'clock? No, we have the meeting, Mr. President. It's not about you, but it is about whatever is current at that time. And so somehow or other, you keep perpetuating this story. I don't know why, because it isn't factual, but nonetheless, that was what disappointed him, because he didn't see this rush to impeachment coming out of our caucus in our 9 o'clock meeting, which he thought was called specifically for him. And then that's up to his family and his cabinet and his staff in the White House. This is not behavior that is rises to the dignity of the office of President of the United States. But having said that, as I said, I actually ardently pray for the president, because we need, I don't know, sometimes when we're talking to him, he agrees. And then I said one time, who's in charge here? Because you agree, and then all of a sudden something changes. What goes on there? Who's in charge? And he says he's in charge, and I suspect that he may be. And I suspect he may be even more since yesterday, because I don't think that any responsible assistant to the President of the United States would have advised him to do what he did yesterday. That's it. Thank you all.
About the Warriors.
About the Warriors, almost will not find yellow jackets today, but, let's see the other side play out. I watch every game. I watch almost
You
every
prefer
game.
Toronto or Milwaukee?
Well, I'm kind of, well, I would not like to play against the Greek freak. It would be fun. It would be fun, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy Pelosi, giving a briefing to reporters, says the White House is crying out for impeachment. In a wide-ranging interview that specifically focused on the actions between the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the President of the United States over the course of the last 24 hours or so, you heard a lot from Nancy Pelosi about the behavior of President Trump, about what Democrats intended to accomplish when they went to the White House yesterday, where they were scheduled to meet with the president to talk about infrastructure. Nancy Pelosi saying that the president found some excuse to walk out of the infrastructure meeting. A lot of things that were said at this press briefing that Nancy Pelosi just delivered, including that the president's behavior, she calls it obstruction, ignoring subpoenas, is an assault on the Constitution itself. And at one point, and I want to ask Rebecca Kaplan about this, a reporter asked Nancy Pelosi a question, and she mentioned the 25th Amendment. For those of you who are following along and who are familiar with our Constitution and our constitutional amendments, the 25th Amendment, which was proposed by the Congress in the wake of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, provides the procedures that would replace the president or the vice president in case of death, removal, resignation, or incapacitation. And we saw that applied at some point during the Watergate scandal when Gerald Ford replaced the vice president Spiro Agnew. And so it's interesting and curious that Nancy Pelosi would mention that, but the language that she was using, saying that the president is crying out for impeachment. In one point, she said she will, quote, not take responsibility for irresponsible behavior of the President of the United States. So let's get straight to our Capitol Hill producer, Rebecca Kaplan, who's joining us. She was in that briefing. Rebecca, I just want to, as I reminded our viewers, I couldn't hear that exchange with a reporter and Nancy Pelosi when the 25th Amendment was referenced, which is the amendment that provides the procedures for replacing the President of the United States in the event of death or incapacitation. What was that all about?
Well, he was asking about her comments that maybe the staff needed to intervene with the president, and then Pelosi actually brought up the 25th Amendment and was sort of joking that the reporter suggested that, which he did not actually do. But, you know, clearly Pelosi is showing that she is not afraid to kind of engage in this confrontation with the president publicly, talking about that he is engaged in a cover-up, and she's really not afraid of commenting on his behavior, even though it is clearly something that provokes him and led to that really tense not Oval Office, but meeting in the White House yesterday that ended quite abruptly after just 3 minutes.
Yeah, she said, I'm concerned about his well-being and that his staff should somehow have an intervention for the president.
Yeah, certainly things are quite tense these days, and I think, you know, she was not being entirely serious, but there is a recognition that the president controls his own behavior, and I think you especially see this when it comes to negotiations between the White House and Capitol Hill, that no one can really speak for the president, and ultimately anything that's going to happen up here has to be really an agreement between the president and leaders in Congress, because anytime we've seen staff lead negotiations on these issues, it does become rather difficult and often ends with the president saying he wouldn't actually sign something that his staff thinks that he might. So here, you know, we just see Pelosi is feeling, I think, quite liberated by her position these days, and clearly she knows that Trump, there's something about her interactions with the president that really gets him, and she is kind of in this unique position of power.
So let's get to the substance of what Congress was trying to accomplish by going to that meeting with the president, and what the president had suggested after he met with Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer just about 3 weeks ago, which is that he wanted to come up with a deal to fix America's failing infrastructure. Nancy Pelosi says in that press briefing that she went there with the other leaders of the Democratic Party to negotiate with the president in good faith, but that the president intended, before they had even turned up at the meeting to walk out because she said that he called her the night before and said he wanted her to first work on what many people call NAFTA 2.0, which is the Mexico-U.S. trade agreement. Just break that down for us, because there were so many people on both sides of the aisle who had good feelings 3 weeks ago when we heard from both the president and the Democratic leaders.
Absolutely. So as you remember, about 3 weeks ago, you referenced this initial meeting, and infrastructure is one of the few areas that we thought it might be possible for the president and Congress to work together because there's mutual interest there. So they had this meeting 3 weeks ago. Everyone emerges feeling very kumbaya. But Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer in the Senate made a point of saying, you need to tell us how you're going to pay for it, because there was a concern that Republicans on the Hill are going to be loath to spend billions of dollars on any infrastructure deal. So they said, Mr. President, you tell us how to pay for it if you want to do a $2 trillion deal, and we are definitely interested in talking about that. So we saw some signs that this might be unraveling the night before yesterday's meeting. The president sent this letter to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer saying, no, we have to do the NAFTA agreement before the new NAFTA agreement, the USMCA, before we move on to infrastructure. And they sent back this statement that said, we're going to do infrastructure. Tell us how you're going to pay for it. And what Speaker Pelosi was alluding to today was the fact that the president was kind of maybe realizing that he was not going to be able to get congressional Republicans on board with this plan. And he did not have a proposal that was going to be acceptable to his own party about how to pay for $2 trillion in infrastructure. So she suggested that that might have been part of the reason that he walked out of this meeting. There was also, she said, that he wanted to distract from these court decisions that have been coming out all week, ruling in favor of the House, saying that the House is able to subpoena financial institutions for the president's personal finances, or from the fact that the House is not moving towards an impeachment inquiry of the president, even though there are several members who are saying they think it's time to open one in light of White House officials repeatedly refusing to come before Congress to testify.
Speaker Pelosi called President Trump a master of distraction. When we spoke to our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, earlier this morning, Rebecca, he talked about the ways that historically infrastructure projects have been paid for. You just talked about the fact that the president doesn't seem to have Republican leaders on board with whatever idea that he had when it came to infrastructure projects. So are Republicans in the Senate and in the House of Representatives in favor of an infrastructure plan and proposal? And if they are, what would they suggest, or how would they suggest paying for it? Or is it that the president says he's in favor of it, but Republicans are not?
I think it's more of the latter. And infrastructure is always one of those things that it is broadly easy to say that you are in favor of, because obviously it is something that directly benefits constituents in every corner of the country. It's not particular to one region or one district. So that does help. But I think one very telling sign was last year the president put forward a much smaller infrastructure plan that only called for $200 billion, so 1/10 of the $200 trillion, $200 billion, mostly in private investment that he thought would boost up to a total of $1.5 trillion in total investment, just kind of by economically kind of boosting the spending on infrastructure. And even Republicans didn't take up, when they controlled the House and Senate last year, that plan didn't go anywhere up here. You know, they talked about it. They said, oh, this is interesting. We'll take a look. But they never actually moved to put it on the floor and pass it or do anything very serious about this plan. So clearly there's not a ton of agreement here between Republicans and the president on how much money to spend. And certainly now that Republicans are back in the minority in the House, they are not going to advocate for huge amounts of government spending. That's a position that they have been taking for several years now. And I think one thing that's we've seen up here on Capitol Hill is that it's always easier to oppose a lot of government spending when you're in the minority and you're just blocking whatever the majority party wants to do.
Right. So the president earlier today tweeted about the Democrats that it is not possible for them to investigate and legislate at the same time. Their heart is not into infrastructure, lower drug prices, pre-existing conditions, and our great vets. All they are geared up to do, 6 committees, is squander time day after day trying to find anything which will be bad for me. But from all the reporting out there, it does sound as if the president just can't drum up the money from his own party to pay for what I think Nancy Pelosi was appealing to him when she referenced, again, I thought it was interesting she referenced those historical presidents yesterday. She did it again today when she talked about Thomas Jefferson and his big plan, the Louisiana Purchase, expanding the United States. She talked about Teddy Roosevelt and our national parks, clearly trying to appeal to the president, saying, hey, look, if you want a big fancy highway or new bridges, the Donald Trump bridge, you can make this one of the defining characteristics of your presidency. Sounds like he wants to do it, but he realizes that he can't.
I think that's certainly something that he probably would be interested in doing. And like I said, it's easy to point to infrastructure and it benefits everyone. It is a clearly deliverable thing that you can show to your constituents that you've been doing up here from Congress. But at the end of the day, this would take a huge amount of agreement on Capitol Hill to talk about how this gets paid for. And some of the options, increasing taxes, cutting spending in other areas, you're going to meet resistance from one side or the other on that. So it's just really something that's very difficult to achieve when you actually get down to talking about numbers and how much you're going to spend on a big project of this size.
Yeah, deficit spending, something historically Republicans do not like to do.
Exactly.